Is this working? Yeah. So, hello. Welcome. Good evening. On behalf of the Departments of Sociology, History, and Philosophy, the Program in Women's Studies, the John Lennon Society, and the Campus Activities Board, I'd like to welcome to Northern Illinois University the internationally known scholar and activist Raya Dunayevskaya. Raya Dunayevskaya has spent a lifetime as a Marxist and feminist theorist and social activist. She's the former secretary to Leon Trotsky in Mexico. She's the author of a pioneering analysis of Russia as a totalitarian state capitalist society beginning in the 1940s. She developed this in the 1950s into a concept of Marxist-Humanism when her first book, Marxism and Freedom, from 1776 until today, was published. This book included as appendix, in English for the first time anywhere, her translation of the 1844 humanist essays of the young Karl Marx. In the 1960s and 1970s, Dunayevskaya deepened her study of Marx's humanism and its roots in Hegelian dialectics when she made analyses which saw Hegel's absolute idea in what she termed the post-World War II freedom struggles of women, blacks, youth, and rank-and-file labor, as well as East European and Chinese dissidents. At this time, she wrote that, quote, "Until the development of the totalitarian state, the philosophical foundation of Marxism was not fully understood because we live in an age of absolutes on the threshold of absolute freedom out of the struggle against absolute tyranny." This resulted in her second major work, perhaps her most comprehensive, Philosophy and Revolution, from Hegel to Sartre and from Marx to Mao. That book, published in 1973 and a second edition 1982, also subjected the radical movements of the 1960s to a Marxist-Humanist critique, not only in the US, but in Africa, China, and Europe as well. In the 1980s, two new types of directions are seen in her work. First of all, in response to today's third world revolutions, such as the Nicaraguan Revolution, she has made an analysis of Marx's last writings in the last decade of his life, 1873 to 1883, where Marx had examined the Iroquois Indians and the rural Russian village and its communal form of organization as a possible starting point for a socialist society if it could link up with the movement in the developed lands. Secondly, she made an analysis of Marx's ethnological notebooks on the problem of women's liberation in primitive and modern society. In the 1980s, out of this work, she produced her two most recent books, Rosa Luxemburg, Women's Liberation and Marx's Philosophy of Revolution, 1982, and the most recent of all, Women's Liberation and the Dialectics of Revolution, 1985. She is presently working on a study entitled Dialectics of Organization and Philosophy, the Party and Opposite Forms of Organization Born out of Spontaneity. The topic of her lecture for tonight is a wide-ranging one: youth of the 80s, youth of the 60s, the other America, and the idea of freedom. And once again, I want to welcome to Northern Illinois University, Raya Dunayevskaya.
Good evening. I'm very happy to be here. Because, as you know, today, the 13th of April, is 2 weeks since Oral Roberts didn't die. And that means that the Oral Roberts Burial Fund reverted back to the students who have been fighting against the apartheid, who have been fighting for divestment, who have been fighting against racism, who are trying to fight in all directions, whether it be Nicaragua that is against U.S. imperialism trying to invade Nicaragua, or whether it is racism at home. And it's for that reason, that imagination, that brought the 1980s to such a translucent light between the 60s and the 80s, that an actually new time dimension has been created. Now, what is that new time dimension that Hegel had called a birth time of history? Now, before we get to the two historic events, one here closed, the one I'm talking on, 60s, on that, and the really, truly historic dimension of finding a whole new continent of thought and of revolution that Marx had founded, we want to know the principle that underlies this thing from any direction, whether it's literature or philosophy or actual revolution. And the greatest American writer, at least I think he's the greatest, Herman Melville, had said it best. I love all men who dive. Any fish can swim near the surface, but it takes a great whale to go downstairs 5 miles or more, and if he don't attain the bottom, why, all the lead in Galena can't fashion the plummet that will. I'm not talking of Mr. Emerson, but of the whole core of thought divers that have been diving and coming up again with bloodshot eyes since the world began. Now, it's today's topic that defines the dual nature of what we're talking on today, of thought divers as well as activists who try to change the world they were born into, but they didn't make. And they want to change it to truly new human relations. Now, the fact that you had been able in the 80s not to be the quiescent 80s, but to bear that resemblance and that strong affinity to the 60s with this help bury Oral Roberts Fund shows something that I want to give you a whiff of the 60s, and we'll start with Mario Savio and the free speech movement, the Negro Revolution and the free speech movement. This is Mario Savio. This is the free speech movement. This is the Negro Revolution. And this is the pamphlet we collaborated on, as well as with Eugene Walker, the Mississippi Freedom Schools on there. Incidentally, for those who don't know how to understand the other America, and there are some who distributed some vile things right here. This is the most beautiful cartoon that was that time also by the British. These are the two administrators of a big university in Britain. Believe me, it belongs to America too. The trustees understand the curriculum requires you to teach Marxism. We just feel you're not making it boring enough. So they're feeling that way. Now, what is it that brought these people? This is the thing that started it all, with that single word that Mario Savio said, sit down. You see, Mario Savio and a lot of students like you had gone down to Mississippi because they were very impressed with the activities in trying to break down segregation there. But they thought they were going down to teach the blacks what real education is. They were from the elite universities of the North, where supposedly there was no discrimination. And what they learned of the education, the freedom schools, was that they were first learning what it is when you study education as a matter of life and death and fighting for freedom. So we were all the radicals, the ones that have always been Marxists, Marxist-Humanists, trying to win over a fellow by the name of Mario Savio, because he was an activist. He had gone down to Mississippi Freedom Summer, and he wouldn't listen to any party or anything. He always thought, no, I'll do it all by myself. Okay, in comes the cops to arrest Weinberg. Weinberg has been arrested so often, he just always was ready, was just going into the car. And suddenly, Mario Savio, who had heretofore not been active in anything, starts taking off his shoe. Everybody was wondering, what the heck is all this about in the middle of this thing? And he goes up on the top of the car, and he says, this car is not going to leave the campus with Weinberger in. Sit down. And all these thousands of students at University of Berkeley sat down, and they wouldn't let the cop car leave with Weinberger there. This continued for several hours, and the cop car didn't leave. They left, but without Weinberg. And that's how the movement had started. We all ran up to Mario and said, what the heck were you doing when you were taking off your shoe, of all things? He said, well, I wasn't giving them an easy excuse that they should say I bent my weight bent the roof of the car. So I decided, or maybe I didn't decide it, I don't know what made me do it. But the point is, I jumped up and I wouldn't get off. The more the administration called for me to get off, the more I wouldn't. They had actually had thousands by that time, and 800 of whom didn't actually occupy the building itself, and this continued for quite a few weeks. Now, it's that kind of imagination which you had shown by Help, Barry, Oral, Roberts, and you deserved money. I hope you got some to help Barry so that you can continue with your work. Now, it's true that the 60s were much more massive, and they went from the Negro Revolution, then we did call it Negro instead of Black, to the free speech movement to the anti-Vietnam War until we finally had stopped the war. But the point was that the high point of the movement, when we thought we'll certainly finally have a revolution, was May 1, 1968 in Paris, France, because then you had the proletariat, 10 million workers walking out with the students to try and protest. And yet, without firing a single shot, de Gaulle stopped the whole thing. Now, what was it that could stop such a tremendous movement by just the threat from the head of the government? You see, the leader, the theoretical leader, if you want to call him, even though he was opposed to it, was Cohn-Bendit. And Cohn-Bendit said, no one over 25 should be listened to. It made it a generational thing. Only those under 25 are we going to have anything to do with. And don't bother with those old fogies who are always telling you about theory. Theory can be caught en route. If he thinks that's how easy it is to have theory, he found out very fast with de Gaulle. Because it is impossible to have a successful revolution without a philosophy of revolution. The two must go together. And when you don't have that philosophy of revolution, that is what happens. So what we are trying to see on that break time of history is when it started but failed, which had sent me into philosophy, but we'll take that up much later. Now, what was the true birth time of history that founded an entirely new continent of thought and of revolution? That was way back when, 1843-44, Marx founded that continent. Now, you know, Marx, I'm starting even before he founded the continent, 2 years before. He was a student just like you were. And he was a radical. Radical at that time meant the left Hegelian. In other words, he was studying philosophy, and he was writing a thesis as far removed from life as you can imagine. The difference between Democritus and Epicurus, that's 500 BC, you understand. But suddenly, what he was really writing about was, what do you do? What is a new beginning? Here I consider Hegel the greatest dialectician, the greatest philosopher that was ever born. And yet I'm writing this thesis on the difference between Epicurus and Democritus because I disagree with him on that one thing. Well, he's a great master. Maybe he just couldn't deal with individual things. He was dealing with 2,500 years. But the point is that the reality, my reality, 1840s, demands something different. It demands something different so that there shouldn't be this terrific division between thought and reality. And they turned on him and they said, what in the hell are you doing? You're a youth. You're not a proletarian. You're a petty bourgeois. You're living a pretty damn good life. You're working on your PhD thesis. You already have a job waiting for you. You're going to be the editor of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. Now, how could life be any better? What in the heck makes you a radical? And his answer was, to be a radical means to grasp something at its root. And the root of mankind is man. I cannot be happy if any man is enslaved, like the peasants here who have to steal wood in order to be heated at all. And I see more laws on the books of Prussia against theft, wood theft, than I see on all other crimes. And he went from that, seeing that difference between reality and philosophy, to transform the revolution that Hegel introduced into philosophy by making the negative factor the revolutionary factor, the one that moves it, that you get freedom, not so much from slavery as through slavery. The man, the slave who wants to throw you off his back is the intelligent man, the freedom fighter, the one who may be illiterate, but his intelligence is greater because there is no division between his intelligence and wanting freedom and his daily life that he's fighting for. And therefore, the revolution in philosophy that you call dialectic, that it shows the negative factor as the moving factor, is the one thing that is revolutionary. But you are dehumanizing that very idea of freedom by making it so abstract that all we see is consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, spirit. In other words, everything is a matter of a stage of consciousness and a feeling of alienation from this world, it is true, but you get into another stage of alienation, and even the spirit is alienated too. So what are you doing? You are dehumanizing the idea. The brain isn't over there in the sky somewhere, outside of your body. The brain is in your body. The man is whole. He's got a brain, he's got a heart, he's got hands. And there is no division between the mental and the manual. So this, our revolution from being in philosophy has to be brought into life. And therefore, from a philosophy of revolution in philosophy, it becomes a philosophy of revolution. And these negative factors have names. It is class struggle, it is race struggle, it is struggle between man and woman. You may have thought that when I said to be radical means to take something at its root, and the root of mankind is man, that therefore man is superior to women? Not a chance. The most disgusting things of all in this alien, capitalist, exploitative, racist society is the relationship of man to woman. If you didn't believe one single thing I have said on exploitation, on the law of value, on all the other questions, How dare you have used, for example, the question of black and slave as if they were synonymous or something. Everyone has been a slave at one time or another in his life. It depends on the historic period and who is the majority and who is the minority in your particular country. So I say, if you believe none of these things, just look what you are doing to women. Now, I'm not talking about a woman you hate. This is the woman you love. This is the woman you've chosen as your wife. This is the woman you love so much you'll die for her. So why in the hell is she in the house and doing all the work, and you are the one that's doing all the thinking and writing and so forth? What are her thoughts? What are her relations? And you should be so ashamed of this society that this is the way you treat the one you love, because she's a different sex, that you should want to uproot it. So I will call my philosophy a new humanism, neither capitalism as the exploitation of man by man through the instrument of the machine, nor vulgar communism that thinks all you have to do is abolish private property and you will have a new society. Neither idealism that is abstract and is talking about consciousness and self-consciousness and everything and never saying the person in whom this consciousness and self-consciousness is, nor materialism, somebody who thinks that just possession really shows you what it is. But the unity of idealism and materialism, the unity of philosophy and revolution, that which will start altogether new human relations by destroying the old class, race, sex, society, and starting all over again. So it's this absolute which you have thrown the shroud over with all those abstractions. It actually shows the movement of history of men and women struggling with various stages of freedom. Now, what happened in '68 was to make very real that if this revolution, even as high as it was, whether it was Columbia University or whether it was Paris, that was the question. If it could go down so easily with the threat of the goal, that it would go back to Germany that had just fought in a whole world war, rather than to give in to the second world within each country. It's not a stranger. It's your own masses. It's your own people that you're against. So that at this time, we would have to turn to see more of what it is, but we can't turn to more philosophy before we see the 80s as compared to the 60s, and why I think that instead of belaboring the point that we are not the quiescent generation, I turn to especially 85 to 87, but you do have to keep in mind that with the Reagan retrogression, we had called the particular period tomorrow is now. If someone like Reagan can try to roll history back, try to roll the life back, whether it's in racism or whether it's in any of the other so-called victories we had in the 60s, whether it was in the 70s, whether it was on women's rights or on human rights or on welfare rights, and call counter-revolutionaries the founding fathers of this country. God in heaven. Then you have to know that there is no way that you can possibly do it without doing it very deep and totally uproot this society that can so reach the thing. You know, it doesn't make any difference whether it's Grenada you're suddenly overrunning or Libya that you're trying to destroy and kill the leader of an independent country and try to say that it wasn't really that. And the low and abysmally low thing when you say, well, the child wasn't really his daughter, was adopted. Now, pray tell me, what's a child that's adopted from a child that you had yourself? That's really something. Okay, so what had started in the divestment movement wasn't only the movement to see that this propping up of the worst regime in the world, the apartheid South African regime, by the Reagan administration, stop at least in the form first of not investing in that country. Okay. Look at what really happened. Let's take some of the elitist colleges. On November 15, 1985, Dartmouth had not only a demonstration, but decided that in collaboration or solidarity with Crossroads, South Africa, they will build shanty towns on that beautiful, magnificent campus, you know, upsets the environment to have this thinking. And who do you suppose comes to break this down? The college Republican club, or whatever the heck they call it, with sledgehammers, you see. They're not the violent ones, you see, to break down that demonstration of solidarity. So that they not only continue, that is the revolutionary students, the majority, with their divestment, but they now show that they really don't want to be separate as students from workers. So they go over to the U.S. steel workers on strike, and they have a line of solidarity, you know, a picket line on there, and meanwhile demand that the president of their college that invests in South Africa, and that is also the president or one of the officers of U.S. Steel, give up the, you know, be removed from the job. Now that wasn't the only, even though by then it was two. They then unite with 1,500 anti-nuke demonstrators and go to a Seabrook power plant and show that it's not only against nuclear arms, but against arms of any kind, militarization altogether, or whether it's so to speak for peaceful purposes. That's really something. Peaceful purposes, really. And this catches on where we have a lot of the universities, whether it's Columbia University, whether it is, and there's another absolutely new and beautiful thing happening in the 85, 87 thing, and that is that the youth are getting younger every day. Now, you know, right here, you don't have to go very far. It's Chicago environment somewhere. Lindblom High School. 2,000 students of the high school against, you know, the idea that you can't leave the classroom for your lunch. You got to eat it in. What do you suppose that is? They don't want the blacks to go out to meet any whites in the neighborhood or to sit next door. This is the North, you know, not the South. In other words, it moves much deeper than what was the original movement against segregation, because it's racism right here. There is no division between North and South, as you can see, whether it's Forsyth, Georgia, or Queens, New York City, or Chicago, the high school. Because we had seen in every revolution that is so. You always have new forces, whether it's the blacks, the women, the youth, and the youth, as I said, are always getting younger. You know, there was one youth that particularly impressed me very greatly in the Hungarian Revolution of '56. He was only 12 years old, and he was a big Molotov cocktail user. So we went up and we said, now wait a minute, where the heck did you learn that? He says, oh, the communists teach you that in school. What they didn't teach us, and what is ironic, is they taught us how to use it outside against others. We decided to use it against our officers right here. Yes, that is what is happening in the high schools right now. And it's not only here, because you will see in the internationally, whether it's the Haitian Revolution, whether it's South African revolutionists have been fighting all the time, whether it's Philippines, whether it's all of the Latin American states. And I want to say that when Marx called his philosophy a new humanism, it didn't make any difference when he changed the name, whether it was Communist Manifesto or whether it was the First Workingmen's International. He never changed the fact that until you actually have the division between mental and manual labor cut out, and you have all of your abilities and the self-development of them, you will never have a new society. Now, in addition to the fact that the elitist colleges had gone into divestment and now going into fight racism, you had a lot of places that you didn't expect anything from. Who expects something in Laramie, Wyoming? Well, they were one of those that had built a shanty town. Or in Salt Lake City, the Utah. I mean, not so much the city as the fact that it's all the Mormon capital. And it's that university that was involved. And there were many others like it. Now, right now, as we are in '87, whether today's, I'm sure you watched your latest news, whether it's Amy Carter and 16 others in Amherst, Massachusetts, or whether it's the others, that is what is happening now. And there is absolutely nothing that you have to say that is a retreat, because what you have learned and what the 60s hadn't learned, even they were more massive, was that you do have to fight for both the philosophy of revolution and revolution. It's for this reason that I want to return to the end of the end of 68, 69, so that we know what happened. I didn't mean to skip over 70s altogether, but I wanted to reserve it for what is it that had brought about the search and the digging deep into philosophy. I read before on literary democracy, the Declaration of Cultural Independence in America by Larsa Reed, but I happened to read it from my book, Philosophy and Revolution, because that reproduces it. Okay. The minute that destruction of the great movement in '68 and this idea that you can go catch philosophy en route had happened, I had gone back, because that's what happens at every single period, whether it's the 1840s to 1843, is really 40 years, because whether it's 1843 or it's last year, 1883, you find that Marx, whether he's doing just the essay, the humanist essay, when he first founds the new continent of revolution and thought called the New Humanism, or whether it is the 50s when he writes the Grundrisse, the beginning of the economic studies, the first draft of Capital, when he defines the same thing as negation of the negation and revolution and permanence as the absolute movement of becoming. Everything, that is also a phrase of Hegel's, is the absolute movement, your own self-development, and therefore everyone's own self-development until we have this new society. And therefore, at all critical turning points in history, you have a return to what it is that is hidden in that absolute of Hegel that wasn't really so absolute. In other words, the darkness, it was really the movement of both the movement from theory and the movement from practice that is itself a form of theory towards a unity, which is the philosophy of revolution. So this, and the same thing happened in World War I, when suddenly the most materialist of all materialists, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, had suddenly said, well, now if Marx's roots were in Hegel and not in the economics only, let's return and see what is there. So that it happens also in World War II, when a new generation has arisen. And this new generation is the one we're talking to right now, this audience that Hegel. So this takes up all of Hegel's works, the major Hegel works, Phenomenology of Mind, Science of Logic, the Philosophy of Mind, the 43 to 83 works of Marx, because you have to see that the reason we consider that the 80s has laid the trail, the 1880s for 1980s, is because he discovered the what he considered the pre-capitalist societies, what we call the third world, when the first anthropological studies started, and he found out that the Iroquois women in this country had more freedom than the great big developed British and French, all the technologically developed countries in the West, in the way they made decisions and so forth, in the ethnological notebooks, and that he called Revolution and Permanence there, or whether it was the existentialists of our era, that is the first post-WW2 world, and finally the new passions and new forces, the youth, the black, the women in this country and in all other countries, because we have in Africa, especially Frantz Fanon, who had given up his French citizenship to become one in Algeria, and called his philosophy humanist. You know, this is very peculiar. Fidel Castro, who won freedom from both Batista and American imperialism by his own things, never mind that he's communist now, or says he is. It was not communism that brought it to him, it was he. It was the Cuban Nazis that won. He said, my color is battle green, neither red, which is communist and doesn't give you political freedom, nor black, which is fascist and doesn't give you economic freedom, but mine is battle green, and I call it humanism. Well, I end this book with these two, and I will end this here, of our reality with the Ronald Reagan retrogression. The reality is stifling. The transformation of reality is a dialectic all its own. It demands a unity of struggles for freedom with a philosophy of liberation. Only then does the elemental revolt release new sensibilities, new passions, and new forces, a whole new human dimension. Ours is the age that can meet the challenge of the times when we work out so new a relationship of theory to practice that the proof of the unity is in the subject's own self-development. Philosophy and revolution will first then liberate the innate talents of men and women who will become whole. Whether or not we recognize that this is the task history has assigned to our epoch, it is a task that remains to be done.
Okay, there's going to be plenty of time for questions and discussion, but first a couple of the organizations that help sponsor the talk tonight want to make announcements, and I'm first going to introduce Jim Fabris of the John Lennon Society.
My first announcement is that on Wednesday night at 8 p.m. in the D-Formal Lounge of the students of Stevenson Towers North, we're going to be holding a meeting about the quote-unquote riot that happened last Thursday. I have flyers here that have to be handed out. They say, mass meeting, were you at the quote riot? Are you mad about police actions? Are you mad about the arrest of Greg Thomas? Come to the meeting and voice your opinion. So after the lecture's over, if you live in the residence halls and you want to distribute flyers, come up and talk to me and I'll give them to you. Also, tonight, the City Council is voting on whether they're going to ban buses from North Greek Row, and there are we need a lot of students at the City Council meeting. So after the lecture, you could go over to the City Council meeting and voice your opinion about the banning of the buses. And I have a petition that someone asked me to ask you people to sign about the city banning buses. And Steve Capitan would like to make an announcement too. Thank you.
I just wanted to say that, first of all, that it's really refreshing to have someone who challenges each one of us to think about the fundamental worldview that we have on life, and one who urges us to examine the root of our political and social orientation. On this campus, we of the Northern Illinois Peace Action Committee and the John Lennon Society have worked on peace issues, civil liberties issues, civil rights issues, as well as justice. In the area of civil liberties, we have focused on the issue of drug testing, having a right to have make your own choice as to the disposition of your bodily fluids, and what that means in implication for your work and your whole career that could ride on that drug test. In the area of civil rights, the issue of racism, the issue of sexism. These are questions that deal with our everyday lives. The issue of justice and peace, which involves the right of self-determination of people in places like Central America and Southern Africa to decide for themselves whether they agree with us or our system or not, but to have their own choice. And with that regard, there is a national mobilization in opposition to Reagan policy in Central America and Southern Africa. And there is going to be a march and rally in Washington, D.C. on April 25th. And if anyone would like to go, we're taking a bus from DeKalb, and there's a sign up in the back. We will be leaving Friday at about 5 p.m., the 24th, and return Sunday at about noon. So if anybody would like to participate, we have a table set up in the back. There's also some information, a couple of articles, one about Central America, one about South Africa, if you wish to get an idea of what our opinion is about those issues. Thank you.
Let me just also mention that in the back are also many of the books and articles by Raya Dunayevskaya are available. In some cases, I believe they're free. Okay, so the floor is open for discussion and questions, and I just want to point out there's 2 mics in the aisles, if you prefer to use those, or if you want to try to shout it out from the floor, it's up to you. Who would like the floor? Okay, go ahead.
Are these on?
Are those mics on? The floor mics?
My name is Gary Ambler. I'm the newly elected president of College Republicans. First of all, I'd like to say we were involved in the anti-racism rally, and the Star failed to mention that fact. The Republican Party is determined to stamp out racism on this campus and in this country. The issue I'd like to address is talking about South Africa. I think one of the things that the left in general has problems seeing, and I'd like you to comment on it, is that divestment. If companies pull out of South Africa, the jobs they're taking out of South Africa are the jobs that the black workers hold. The whites don't hold those jobs. Divestment in South Africa hurts the blacks. It's a basic economic issue. If you sit down and study it, you'll realize this. And I'd like to have your comments on that.
So we have some Republican vigilantes here, do we? The point is, well, I mean, they were students on Dartmouth too, and what they did to the other. Yes, there is a second America, and that isn't the minority, it is the majority, and they want to see equality right here and no racism. And we're not talking about South Africa, we're talking about the USA, and it's not the South USA, it's the North USA, it's Lynwood High School right here, it's the college right here, and that is what we're talking about. And they want freedom just as much as anyone else. And no one is going to call me otherwise. It just happens to be that so far as communism is concerned, or the kind that's in Russia, I was fighting long before you were, or anyone in this administration, or any other administration. They were trying to stop my expose, not only of the fact that Stalin had reversed Marxism entirely into its opposite, but even the fact that I exposed what was there, and you discovered it only when a reactionary called it the Gulag, but you didn't when I showed that it was here.
Insults that were pointed out here tonight. I think you're insulting people's intelligence and black people's intelligence by trying to equate Marxism and communism with anti-racism. They may point out that Anthony Bryan, a former Black Panther, became anti-communist after spending 12 years in a Cuban jail after trying to hijack a plane to Cuba. There's a few others. Rosie Greer, a former Green Bay Packers player, he leads a conservative anti-communist group, but it's mostly blacks. I think it's just, there's also Marxist theory, divide and conquer, black against white, old against young, rich against poor, capitalist against proletariat. Millions of people die after Marxism gets gets in power consolidated, no matter where it's applied on the globe, people die, people get arrested, people get thrown in concentration camps, re-education camps. People say, oh, well, the Soviets loused up Marxism, but true Marxism would be different. To me, Marx is just selling us a lemon. Whenever you have to take away all private property, all people's rights, of course you're going to have to take away rights and things like that, in order to make this new society, to wipe it clean. All you really have is a 1984 type of state, and eventually, if the whole world gets that way, I personally knew people. I knew an Ethiopian, who got tortured for 3 hours because he was printing out, trying to have a student protest. All his co-members got shot down in cold blood in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. He was a university student there. People don't realize that.
Could you please ask the question, because other people, I think, want to take
Well, I
place.
wasn't just making, a question. I was making
Whatever,
statements
in other
into
words,
some air.
Statement of
Fidel Castro may now claim to be a Marxist-Leninist, which he isn't anyway, but the point is he didn't make his revolution as that. He made his revolution as native, and if we hadn't been so close to Batista, it wouldn't have been that way. Yes?
It's not necessarily true.
Okay, I'm sorry. I think I'm going to have to let other people take the floor, especially from other parties besides the Republican Party, who I think...
Well, we usually underspoken. We usually
I think
don't
the
get enough
Republican
coverage.
Party has been able to have its say, and there's other people that are up and want to take the floor, and I'll call first on Steve.
Yeah.
Well, okay, there it goes. What is your perception of the most common misconception about Marxism that people have in general, especially the critics, but people in general who are often apolitical, but who have very little knowledge of Marxism? What would you say is the most common of those?
You see, Marxism, in Marx's day, as Marx wrote, and you have all his books here, is clearly what he says it is. In other words, a thing that is against capitalism and against what he called vulgar communism and for new human relations. In other words, he was opposed to all alienations, whether they were sexist, whether they were exploitative, whether they were racist. And in order to establish both internationally good relations and so forth. Okay, communism, as it is now practiced in Russia, and as it has been ever since Stalin's day, is the exact opposite. It's exploitative, only it's state capitalism instead of private capitalism, if there is such a thing as private and corporate capitalism. It is exactly like capitalism in the way it treats its minorities. It doesn't happen to be against black because it has no black population. It's just that simple. What's against Georgians or it's against Ukrainians, and I happen to be Ukrainian, and it is against many minorities. They have more than you can shake a stick at, all the way from Muslim down too. So the question is the exact opposite, especially. But they have the advantage of the fact that they came in late on the scene and they weren't practicing imperialism at that time. The first thing Lenin did, it was tear up all the secret agreements that the Tsarism had imposed and give freedom to Finland and a lot of the minorities first. It stopped very soon, but at the beginning he gave it. So that the communism, I do not at all call communism. My name is the state capitalism that calls itself communism. And I spent 4 years studying the Russian documents when the Hitler-Stalin Pact. I said, anybody who is that opposite to what they were originally supposed to be, a worker society, has to have deep economic roots and deep political roots, and I want to find them, and that's what I had found before it happened. The reason that the State Department here and all that was so much against was because they were allies in World War II, but I was never an ally.
Okay, on the right here.
I'd like to ask you, in regards to the comments that we had earlier by the Republicans, they seem to show their ignorance quite clearly. I'm glad they talked before I got up here. They seem to, they naturally equate Marxism with the USSR, and I would have a hard time believing that any of them ever even read Marx, but yet they vehemently attack it. I was wondering if you come across this as strongly in other countries as you do in this country, the United States.
In other words, the question is whether one finds as strong an identification of Marxism with Russian communism in other countries or only in the United States.
I'm sorry to say that there is more in the United States, it's true, but it's everywhere. It is the fact that you do have two such opposites. Each country has two worlds within the country, those who exploit and those who pollute the spiritual atmosphere, the intellectual atmosphere. I think Reagan has done more to exploit the spiritual atmosphere than that, to call counter-revolutionaries as if they were the founders of this country, when in fact it was only the fight for freedom from there. Or what is this whole constitutional 200? We had to do a lot of amendments before we made it anything that could be called democracy, because originally the Constitution was opposed to the Declaration of Independence. That's what it was for. That said all men are created equal, right? Okay, right off the bat, they didn't want the slaves to be equal. So they said all men are created equal, but they really meant only all white men. They didn't mean the black man. And the black man had to go through another 100 years or something before ever he got his freedom. And then he had to fight for it because the whole country would have been lost altogether. You never would have had unity. But you can't say that it's the only country because Russia is exploitative. South Africa is the worst of all countries, and so forth. So it isn't a question. It's just the fact that you have to realize that you have to fight, and you have the second country within each land. Do we still have two more questions or something?
Professor Lemaitre.
Good evening, and thank you for visiting our university. I would be interested in knowing what your feelings are about the fact that Honduras is now an armed camp, and military exercises are about to begin in full scale in Honduras. And do you envisage a full-scale invasion of Nicaragua or not?
What's now going on in Honduras is just the most fantastic and horrible thing. They are just practicing how to invade Nicaragua. That's what Honduras is. 50,000, what the heck are 50,000 Americans doing in Honduras? They are practicing how to invade Nicaragua. That's what they're doing, and it's right on the Nicaraguan border. I hope that everybody is going to end up on August 25th in Washington, so we are all at the rally against apartheid South Africa and against all the imperialist actions in Honduras. We started with Salvador, and they haven't gone. They tried 16 different ways. But there's one thing Reagan hasn't succeeded and won't, because we will stop him. When he actually gets to want to send soldiers, American soldiers, to die for establishing the Somoza. For heaven's sakes, if we hadn't supported Somoza so long, we could have been with Nicaragua, not choosing necessarily Russian side. They were the most genuine native indigenous freedom fighters you had in Latin America. You know, I have been in Latin America since 1937. When I was in Mexico, when the very first nationalization of oil was initiated by Cardenas. And don't think that Roosevelt wasn't thinking of invading Mexico. He was certainly thinking of it, but don't forget it was a different era. First of all, we were in Depression, and they were plenty worried about their own conditions. In other words, the masses in this country. Secondly, so it was clear that they weren't going to invade there. Secondly, Cardenas was a very different type of person. In other words, when he nationalized oil, he knew how to not only help the Mexican people, but to appeal to all of Latin America that knew that its very freedom from Spain was immediately taken advantage of by America to impose its rule down there. And I was constantly giving messages between Trotsky and Cardenas and hailing him for being that brave of nationalizing the industry. But now there's only two dominating thoughts in Reagan's mind and how he pollutes the air in addition to that. One is how to get Latin America to stay within the American imperialists. It's his legs, you see. And the other one is how to get America back to depression.
Hey, there's time for one more question, I think, over here.
One of the largest objections that seems to be standing out against communism is the idea that it's seen as incompatible with organized religion and various forms of spirituality. And I was wondering, are there Marxist theorists from the humanist perspective who find themselves compatible with religions and with spirituality, if not necessarily organized religions in their most conservative aspects? There's kind of a reproach between the two of them on the humanist side.
It has nothing to do with religion, but there are many occasions when it works together with religious groups, and that religious group is fighting for a certain freedom. Yes, there are Marxist-Humanists all over the world. And certainly I consider myself a Marxist-Humanist. I founded it in this country. But the point is that it isn't an individual thing whatsoever, because what happened is reality. And the reality was that the first struggle for freedom from communism in East Europe, and the first struggle for freedom from communism in East Europe was way back 1953, June 17th, in East Germany. It had never happened before. Everybody said you can't do it under communist totalitarianism. But the East Germans did it originally. They tried and they raised the slogan, bread and freedom. And I hailed that as the first sign not only of the fight against their, but because they did learn Marxist language, they had founded the whole period, in other words, 53 to 56, the East German, Poland, and then the Hungarian was the high point of that period. The original humanist essays of Marx, you see, they had never been found, and people didn't even know he was a humanist. They thought he was an economist. And they brought out from the archives, not as archival material, but as the genuine material of what was called economic freedom in Marx, so that you had it in East Europe first. And in fact, they called it toward Marxist-Humanism. I'm sorry to say that the first one who wrote that was Kolakowski, who is now a quite westernized reactionary. But in any case, then he had written quite differently. And all through East Europe it was that. Okay, Then it traveled to Castro and Latin America, because that has very deep roots, Marxism, and its genius root all through Latin America. And the statement I read from Castro in 59, history will absolve me, was that his was battle green, it was humanist, it wasn't either communist or capitalist. You know, there are a lot of things that happen suddenly when you realize that, oh my God, I'm only 90 miles from the shore of America, and that's so big, and I'm so little. What can I do when you suddenly start compromising with other countries? And then it went all the way to Africa. Now, 1960, and incidentally, the reason April is so important isn't only this August 25th rally in Washington, D.C. now. April was considered Freedom Month by all of Africa because the first 16 countries to gain freedom in West Africa were April, and it was 1860. So they had considered it communist, both in Senegal and in Senghor, in other words, I advertise them, and in France Fanon, the wretched of the earth. But it was in many of the countries that they preferred not being tied to one of the two polar, because there really is no difference between Russia, two of a kind is what I wrote about Gorbachev and our dear Ronald Reagan. The Republicans evidently love him. So that it is in everywhere now. What they do is the principles of Marxism in classes, in papers, newspapers, news and letters you have probably found on the back there, in various pamphlets and so forth. And they do not separate that from activity. So that, for example, with the liberation theology, about 2 years ago, was it 2 years ago? When was the Pope in Mexico? I think about 2 or 3 years ago. I know I was so surprised to get, I was in Mexico again, and I was very surprised to get an invitation from the priests to please address their conference, because they were having an alternate conference to the Pope on the liberation theology. So I'm not religious and I don't pretend to be. But the point is that they invited me and they had very wonderful reviews of Philosophy and Revolution, because they recognized that to fight for liberation theology, you do have to admit that the secular humanism has, a place, and they want to fight with them, and we are very good fighters. So they accepted us, and we accepted to be with them. But that's not our principle. We're not for it. We're not for any religion. But we do fight with them. And incidentally, I want to point out that the most beautiful article, and believe me, even the Republicans, whoever they are here, would admit, right, okay, you'll have to admit that the Wall Street Journal is not a Marxist paper, and neither is the New York Times. Well, they were describing the new South Korean youth, and they said this is a new kind of radicals that have been born here. We don't understand that they sit in the classroom, they study Marxism, then they go out to make all these demonstrations and so forth. And that is what is new and characteristic and genuine of our 1980s, that we do not separate the theory from the practice.
On behalf of all the sponsoring organizations, I'd like to thank our speaker for coming in a most stimulating evening. And we have one more announcement about an informal continuation of the discussion.
We're having an informal reception sponsored by the Women's Studies Department over at Wirtz House. right outside the Student Center, and you're welcome to join us.
Who disconnects me?
Disconnect you.